For as hard as you work for the patient revenue that you get, why on earth would you risk that with bad compliance practices? It seems obvious maybe when you hear me say it out loud, but as we speak today, this week, some listeners are playing with compliance fire, and maybe they don't even know it. Why would you do that? Well, my guest today has insights on this, on where you might be at risk and how you can start reducing it. I'm Carl White, principal at Mark Advisory Group, which is a healthcare marketing agency, and I'm also the host of Practice Care. The mission for both is the same, and that's to help private practice owners stay private. Not only is that what they usually want, but care is better when the provider owns the practice, because that's when they're going to have the most freedom to make the clinical decisions that they think are the best. It's different when somebody else owns the practice, because usually, sometimes, eventually, the agenda of the owner creeps into the provider's ear, and nobody's ever at risk, but it sure gives you more to think about. You're already busy enough, so why don't we just keep it privately owned and keep them out of your head with their agenda anyway? And today my guest is Leslie Boles. Leslie is the co-owner and president of Revu Healthcare, that's REVU, a healthcare consulting firm. She has the credentials of CCS, CPC, CPMA, CHC, CPCH, and CRC from the American Academy of Professional Coders, American Health Information Management Association, and the Healthcare Compliance Association. Leslie, thank you for coming on Practice Care.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be talking to you today, Carl.
Well, thank you. I feel the same. And this is one of those topics that if you geek out on it, like I know you do, and I do to a degree, everybody else looks at this and they kind of groan. It's like this necessary thing, but it doesn't have to take over your life, and you do have to be aware of it. Compliance is like, it's like breathing, you can't stop. But there are ways to do it right without taking over the place. So I'm hoping that we can, shed some light on it today. Before we get into that, I want you to fill in your background. Your bio that you supplied was necessarily short. That's what I asked for. I'm kind of curious. Were you sort of, when you were a child, I want to be a compliance officer, or you fell into this? I imagine very few people set their career path on something like this. But how'd you get into this?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked this, because I did not set out to be a compliance professional. I think I have always had an interest in healthcare, and it just so happened early on in my career, while working in a hospital setting, I was working as a secretary in the audiology department. I think they now call it administrative assistant, whichever one works.
Yeah.
And during that time, I did encounter the compliance officer of the hospital. She actually provided a recent Medicare article that was related to the specialty department I was working in, which was audiology at the time.
Okay.
And I was able to interpret it for her. She was actually really impressed by that and was like, hey, when I have an opportunity in my department, you should come work for compliance. And I'm like, I have no idea what that is, but okay.
Sure. What do you mean by that? Yeah.
Yeah, so it just turned out it worked out, and she did eventually have an opening in her department. It was a low-level compliance auditor position. And I started to realize that my natural abilities and tendencies, although I didn't set out to be a compliance officer or compliance professional, it just worked, right? I call myself nosy by nature, and you do have to have a certain level.
Yeah, you do.
Yes, of nosiness, and from an investigative standpoint, to be able to be successful. So it worked out. So I have one of those Cinderella stories you kind of think of.
And how long have you been in the compliance world?
So I've been in the compliance world since 2011 is when I first started. So we're now looking at 12 years.
Wow.
Yeah, which is pretty significant.
This is not a hobby. This is the real thing. Yeah.
No. This is my real deal, Holyfield, as they say. And I, overall, my healthcare experience, I've worked in doctor's offices since the time I was 15. Now, back then, when I was working in a doctor's office, I probably was working in a little too early for my age, but it gave me, more insight into why I wanted to be in healthcare in the future. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's get into it. Before we start talking about, good compliance practices versus bad and how awful people are at it. There's one of the more regulated industries out there is healthcare. This flows down to private practice. So when you say compliance in a private practice setting, what are some of the categories and areas that you mean?
Yeah, so there's a lot, right? Because private practice has evolved so much. There used to be a time when we talked about private practice, we thought, smaller shops, storefront private practice, but it's grown a bunch, quite a bit. And so private practice compliance programs have also evolved. Now, of course, the focus and the objectives won't be the same as something like a healthcare system all the time, but the base of it will, right? The 7 elements of a compliance program will always be a factor for anyone who's looking at building a program. But when I think of a private practice setting, some of the key areas that come to mind are related to HIPAA privacy, right?
Sure.
Others, billing and coding compliance. That's always an area, associating that with auditing and monitoring. Policies and procedures, right? I always talk about this with private practices. You know, sometimes you'll have a private practice that'll have a book of policies and procedures on their shelves, and yet no one has looked at them, no one knows what's in it. And so ensuring that you can actually meet what's in the policy and procedure that you'll have, so that if someone from external were to come and hold you accountable for it, you know how to respond and all that good stuff.
Right.
You know, I also think about physician contracting, right? And all that's associated with contracts, whether they're for, you know, leased employees or employed physicians, employed practitioners, whether they be nurse practitioners, physician assistants. So there is sort of a niche area, but those 7 elements of a compliance program would be applicable in those areas for private practice.
And when you say contracting in those contexts, did you mean like employment contracts or contracts with insurance or both, or?
Both, right? I think about both aspects, because there are provider requirements, conditions of participation, conditions of payment for Medicare. That's also applicable in commercial insurances as well, right? So ensuring most, and a lot of private practices, they actually miss this opportunity, right? To really evaluate their provider you know, enrollment application to see what are the compliance program requirements for you as a provider in that commercial space now, in that commercial plan. And the same thing with Medicare, right? Medicare, it's, and the federal payers are very specific about what they want, but a lot of the commercial payers are following suit. So you have to be mindful of it when you're really enrolling in certain plans. Especially, there's a lot of activity right now about Medicare Advantage and some of the MA plans that are happening out there. So yeah, on both ends, right? And then when we talk about employed or employed physician or physician contracts, I've seen there's a big shift to RVU-based contracts, right?
Yeah, what are those? I've seen it 1,000 times. I've never looked it up. What they stand.
Yes, so
Relative value
unit contracts, right? And RVUs are associated with codes. CPT codes, and each of those have a specific weight, right? And so a lot of the contracts are based on, you know, whether it's productivity or utilization of those particular RVUs associated with those codes, and they're creating employment agreements based on it. It's very common, right? But there are a lot of factors, right? If you're looking at, if you have a physician who you've placed on an RVU-based contract based off of billing data, right, that you received from the previous year, but yet they're coding it incorrectly, well, you could be generating an agreement based off of incorrect information. So, you know, when we think about billing and coding compliance, I hear a lot of people sometimes sort of shy away from it because they're like, well, that's not important. It is extremely important because we make a lot of decisions based off of billing and coding data. So it very, very important and should be top of mind for anyone.
Yeah. And I got to believe when the authorities knock on your door, if you're a private practice, a smaller private practice even, and they find something, the scale may be different than if they found it in a hospital system, but that doesn't get you off the hook. And a smaller penalty might still be really painful for you, even if, you know, so like this whole, it doesn't apply to me. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting. You know, I think a lot of private practice settings have started to reevaluate the way they look at their setting and the size. I think sometimes, you know, I kind of almost link it to church when I'm talking to physicians. You know, you think big church, no problem. I mean, bigger problems. You think small church, small problem. Not true, right? Small practices bring small problems. You have a smaller environment. It's more tight knit. You actually do see more evidence or more opportunities for whistleblowers, which a lot of private practices don't realize, right? You have this close-knit community, you know, someone gets upset, maybe owner's not listening to them, physician owner, they just dismiss what they're saying, the person goes straight to the federal government, right? Thinking about that, like there's no other points of contact for them to go if there's no compliance program, like in a hospital setting where there's no compliance program and quality, there's no one else for them to talk to, right? To get it off their chest. So they take it upon themselves and they go to someone else. So there are benefits to having a barrier, right? From the physician practice owner, or I shouldn't say a barrier, intermediate between employee and physician owner, especially when the physician owner is making all of the decisions. You know, who is your middleman? Who is your Switzerland that can kind of help field some of those concerns that may come up? So there's a lot of avenues to think about.
And so do you, the question is, why does poor compliance seem to be so prevalent in private practice? Do you see it more I mean, I've got a few, stories from, just, in my sort of little corner of it, but I'm wondering what you see.
Yeah, I equate it to this, right? I don't think there's necessarily a lot of data to speak to, where non-compliance is running more rampant in different settings. But I think about it from this standpoint, smaller practices have less controls, right?
Yeah.
They have less controls, they have less touch points. There's less oversight, not because they want it to, but you're running a small business, right? And to an extent. And there's only but so much oversight you can provide as a physician owner who owns the company and also responsible for probably seeing the patients, right? Especially, a one-man van or one,
single doc or whatever.
Show. Right. So I think anytime you have less touch points, less controls, less auditing and monitoring, less education, less voices, it creates sort of a hotbed, potentially. Not intentionally, but unfortunately too, you tie that, which I'm completely understandable of because I am also too a small business owner. And I understand you do have to weigh it out sometimes. Like, I mean, that whole saying, am I going to pay the light bill? I'm going to put food on the table is a very real thing, especially coming on the heels of the pandemic for a lot of, smaller physician practices and even the medium-sized one and the large-sized ones. They're making some tough decisions. So I think there's a lot less resources and a lot less avenues.
Yeah. I wonder if some of it, when you say things like auditing and intermediary and controls, I could see some reacting, oh, that sounds awfully bureaucratic. And already you just like blew a hole in it. And it doesn't have to be, you don't need a department of this. You need the behavior, really.
Right.
And it could be in somebody who's already there. You don't need to like add a lot of cost that's one area I wonder about. And then the another, why is it so prevalent? I see a fair amount of doctor owners just take the practice manager and just dump everything non-clinical on that person. And I've actually said to a couple of clients where I deal with the practice owner, the manager, I'm like, I would never take your job. Would never do it. There's no way. Like there's no end. And, and so I wonder, like, what do you think? Is it the bureaucracy, bad label, stigma? And like, why is it so, lack of knowledge? Like, what do you think?
I think it's a couple of things, right? I think it's doing what you can with what you have. I think that's a big motto. I think no one intends for it to go wrong. You're just doing the best you can with what you have. I also think, and I'll say this, with love, is that physicians going through medical school, a lot of times they're not taught about those other components that could impact their business, right? So when you use the word bureaucratic, I want to shift that to a necessary evil, right? It may not be something you want to hear.
Or just another business process,
It absolutely is, right? I look at it from this standpoint. I always give this example. If you are collecting reimbursement from Medicare, commercial payers, whoever you're collecting reimbursement from, what controls do you have in place to ensure that the money you're receiving you can actually keep, right? To your point, that's a necessary business process. It's almost like reconciling or accounting or audits that you would have to do, or paying the IRS, right? That's the way compliance should be looked at, paying your taxes. I think especially in healthcare. Healthcare is a very regulated environment and it's not going anywhere. There's more regulations happening every day. And I think it needs to be looked at as a business process that's very necessary. And no, you do not have to hire a person specifically for that, but be open to the idea of consulting, right? Out on certain things, maybe once, twice a year. Be open to hiring that individual, like maybe reevaluating or reassessing who you're hiring. Maybe you hire a coder, right, who's also has experience as a phlebotomist, right, so that they can draw the blood in your office, but they can also code. I mean, private practices and small businesses have to really think how to become innovative, right, and using that dual function so that you can save money, right, which we all understand, but also are making decisions that impact your business in a positive way. So
I wonder if, like blind spot too. I mean, as you were saying this, I was thinking, if you think about like the, the functions of a business genericized, there's finance, there's HR, there's, sales, there's a few other things, but there isn't one for compliance, right? You get large enough, and out of necessity, like a larger hospital will have a compliance department, mainly because it's everywhere. And if everyone's responsible for something, then nobody ends up being responsible for it because there's no point person. And so I wonder if that's, just blind spot too.
Yeah, it is. I do, there's a couple of things that I blame. This is my own theory. I think that it needs to be a big part of medical school, residency. I think we don't introduce the concept of compliance until they're getting ready to graduate and go off on their own. And by that time, I think they've already made up in their mind, as physicians, what we're going to do, but it should be a part of their curriculum from day one, from the day they decide to be a physician, because it impacts their entire career in such a huge way. So one false move, one violation of a False Claims Act, one violation associated with privacy could pretty much bring you down if you're uninformed, if you don't know. And I think we have to do a better job in this, in the US, in incorporating it as a necessary part of the industry from day one.
It's such a good point. I mean, in medical school, right? So there's nothing. I mean, just the word business is barely uttered. But as you were saying this, I was thinking, there ought to be like a survey class or a couple, I don't exactly know. And this should be part of it, like, here are the top 15 ways you can lose your license. Or something, like just know it, because you're not going to get told any other way. So in a private practice, are there areas where you see sort of, poor compliance areas of a practice more commonly than others, where you see kind of?
Well, there's a couple of things, right? I'll start with privacy. Most of the time, private practices have a very, I call it, neighborhood friendly environment. And I think it's great, right? I think it's awesome. I think it's amazing. But we have seen instances where privacy violations occur because of that culture. And what most people don't realize about noncompliance most of the time is not created intentionally, right? It's created based off of the environment in which it finds itself, right? So if you have a physician practice where, it's like, hey, Jim, I saw you at the soccer game, then you see Jim out at the grocery store, and he's with his wife, and he didn't want to tell his wife, I'm just being dramatic here, that he had a hemorrhoid, and you removed it. Now his wife knows. That culture could create noncompliance. And I think from that, unintentionally, there's a lot of opportunities there from a privacy standpoint. You see it. Even, I mean, I can't tell you, I've been in private practices where I cringe. They have medical records in the regular garbage. It's like, oh my God,
we should compare notes.
Yes, that is a big thing. I mean, hey, you're making a move from one, you're not hiring a moving company, you're moving 2 doors down, you put the medical records in the trunk, or you have archived medical records that should be going through an archiving system, but yet you're moving it. Little things like that can happen. I see those type of things. But then the other big area that's always concerning for me, and you see it all the time with a lot of all of these different enforcement activities that happen with federal agencies, is with billing and coding compliance, right? It makes me so nervous.
You mean just getting numbers wrong, or that means something more?
Well, getting coding wrong, yes, right? Getting coding incorrectly wrong, because again, coding changes every year, right? The codes that you submit to the insurance company. And so if you don't have anyone that's educating you, or anyone who's knowledgeable about what those changes are, or even just how to report the codes appropriately, right? So that what's reflected on your claim data is correct and accurate. You see a lot of misses with that all of the time from a non-compliance. It's a really huge area. And then just even smaller things. I've seen, I've seen non-compliance associated with documentation issues,
Mm-hmm.
supervision issues, right? I think a lot of practices think about scaling and growing, which is phenomenal, right? But they don't think about the resources need to scale and grow in the way that they desire, right? And so sometimes
Yeah. There's a
that
big,
takes,
big, I don't know what to call it. Like, it's not a debate, but
it's a gap.
nurse
There's a gap.
practitioners are becoming a bigger deal. State
Yes,
by state,
yes,
there's supervision requirements.
right.
And
And
it
what does
doesn't
that
take
mean?
and it doesn't take long to find a practice where on the ground it looks different than how the requirement reads. And you're like,
Right, right, right.
yeah. So yeah.
That's a big one. And then really understanding like licensing and scoping, right? Autonomous, independent autonomous practice authority in Florida versus you maybe New Jersey or California has different meanings, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and if you're gonna have, because I've also seen the mistake of, great physician practices crossing state lines, but not doing their due diligence, not researching, like
Mm-hmm.
what does telehealth mean in this state from a scoping standpoint, a
Mm-hmm.
licensing standpoint? What does now having this, this tech do this diagnostic cardiovascular,
Yeah.
procedure mean for me now? And there's all of those fine line questions that should be a part of the scaling and growth process that sometimes get left off the table. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I could speak to the privacy from my corner of the world. We say we're a HIPAA compliant healthcare marketing agency. Not a single client's prepared to give me a business associate agreement or, do anything
Yes.
else. And I can see protected health information, in a
Yep.
few different ways. So I just said, well, here's a business associate agreement as if you were handing it to me. Let's use
Yep.
that because,
Yep.
so yeah, and some of I don't see a lot of things, but I'm not going to say these stories, but a couple of things I heard from former clients where I went, oh my God, you've got to stop that now. Like,
Right.
oh my
Right.
God,
Yeah.
you
And
know?
I feel bad. You feel bad, but again, I think the biggest area of concern that always impacts me the most is the
Mhm.
lack of not like the lack of understanding, the fact that you don't know, right?
Yeah,
It worries me because healthcare as an industry, we don't separate the regulatory aspect by
yeah,
setting. We don't do that. It
yeah.
applies. It's applicable. And I think more physician owners have to look at the idea of compliance and not for every setting and not just have it over here. Well, that's what hospitals do, or that's what large ambulatory surgical centers do, or large
Yeah,
physician
small
practice.
business is different. Yeah.
No, it's
No,
actually even
unfortunately.
worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I those are some areas that I've seen some interesting things for sure.
Yeah, I'll bet. So where can a private practice get started to like turn the corner, or
You
just
know,
improve their compliance practices?
yeah, I'm always really careful how I answer this question because I have my own healthcare consulting firm, right? And
Yeah,
don't want,
understood.
yeah, I don't want to say, hey,
Call
call me.
me. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
The thing that I will tell, physician owners is, start small, right? With educating yourself.
Hmm.
I think it's really important to see what non-compliance is happening in practices that are equal in size to yours. And what are some of the things that what did they get in trouble over, right? Because that's
Hmm.
the best way to learn, to say, well,
Hmm.
hey, we're kind of doing the same thing. What did they do wrong? And I think, a lot of people tend to stay away from those recent enforcement activities, that come from DOJ, OIG, and all these good stuff. But it's actually really good information
It's
to look at
true.
so that you can avoid doing what they do. I look at them as like warning shots for
Hmm.
you, right? That's
Hmm.
great to say, oh, you use modifier 25 incorrectly based off of this. I'm not going to go that route. You got in trouble for incident 2 services because you didn't have the appropriate supervision. I'm not going to go that route. And it's
Hmm.
actually a really good educational tool. And the reason why I say start with education, because the more you know, the better you are, right? And
Hmm.
it's psychological, right? To say, okay, let me educate myself and really try to figure out how is this going to be important to me? And then
Hmm.
I can apply it to, okay, so what does my practice actually need? I think the biggest problem with consultants in this day and age is that they come in and they tell you need everything. And it's a big turnoff for
Yeah.
physician owners, especially in the compliance arena. I've seen
Hmm.
it on every end. I think it's a better approach to say, tell me what you don't know, right? Tell me what you don't know. Tell me what you're concerned of. Tell me what your understanding of compliance is, and let's work together to help you mature it, right? And when I use the word mature, it's not to be offensive, but a lot of people have an understanding of compliance in an infancy stage, and we want to get to a place of maturity, right? And we want you to come to an understanding of, really making this a priority for your business, because it is good business practice to have compliance elements, programs running in some way, shape, or form. It actually is, a lot of people don't know this, but in the False Claims Act, when they talk about identifying fraud, they say evidence of auditing and monitoring and education and all of the things that they encourage you to do actually is a good indicator, even if they find some evidence of fraud, that could help you through that. And it's just don't avoid it is the way to do it. And just, I always say this too, you have to speak to knowledgeable people. This is one thing I do want to urge everyone listening. I mean, there's a lot of people out there consulting. I see it every day. Sometimes I say to people, why are you consulting? You shouldn't be consulting. Or I'll say to myself in my head, you really have to do your due diligence on who you're working with, right? And you got to do your due diligence on their certifications, their experience, and is it applicable to your setting, right? How does it work? Ask the right questions, talk to more than one vendor. And I'm saying that as a vendor, that's really important for sustainability. So I think the first step would be, just going back to your question, would be to educate yourself, right? Google search what's happening out there. Put a little something in Bing and say, okay, recent enforcement activity, Department of Justice, physician practice, see what's happening.
You with like HIPAA violations, Department of Health and Human Services. It's a nice little website page, and you can read. And you're so right. You can read, and you read, and they're all anonymized, and but they're somewhat granular. And you go, wow, they got fined for that. I mean, I could think of one where I can't remember the type of practice. It doesn't matter. A 6-figure fine for not having business associate agreements. No data was lost or stolen. They just didn't have that step, and they got a 6-figure fine. And it's
the amount of small practices are getting fined for timeliness of access, for not responding to requests for medical records in a timely, within that time frame that the HHS has set out, is incredible. It's incredible. Something as small as that. I mean, it just goes on for days. So I think the education piece is really important. And
it's one of these things where my impression is, if you've never looked into it before, that the question of compliance, it's going to get, as you start to research, it's going to get bigger before it gets smaller, because you're learning yourself, I mean, you are. So but it's a business process. It doesn't have to be that onerous, but it's kind of not optional. So swallow hard and embrace it. We could talk about compliance for a lot longer, but but in the interest of kind of bite-sized advice for our listeners, a couple of wrap-up questions. The first one is there anything you think I should have asked you in the context of our discussion, but just didn't ask you?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing that I would sort of say, and you didn't necessarily have to ask me, but I do want to highlight, there's a lot of conversation around artificial intelligence today, and its impact on our processes. And I think it's really important for private practices to start inserting themselves in the conversation, right? Especially as it relates to the EMR that you use. Most practices are on an electronic medical record, and to avoid, violations, or to avoid any, to avoid non-compliance, I think it's a good time to start asking your vendors, like, hey, what does the system do automatically for us without us even realizing it, right? That's a form of artificial intelligence. I call it 101, right? It's kind of getting an inventory of everything your systems are doing on an automated basis, which part of your systems are learning, what they call machine learning model, right? Where the system is learning based off of the data you're providing it. There's a lot of intricacies happening right now by way of upgrades in EMRs.
And are you saying that some of those might not be sort of compliant, kosher level?
Well, no, I'm not. The intent is always that they are meant to be compliant, right? I think they become non-compliant when the end users don't know that they're there, right? And that they are performing functions that could contribute to non-compliant behavior without them realizing. So again, I go back to the lack of knowing, right? If
Yeah.
you don't know, you can't fix it. And I think it's time for smaller practices to start asking the questions about how AI is impacting their systems.
Interesting. That's wow. There's a topic for another episode, maybe. And the other wrap-up question I ask is, all right, we've caught a listener's attention and they've been sort of scratching their head and wondering about compliance or wondering about their practice. Sometimes people get enthusiastic about doing something or making a change, but they're stuck at the starting line, right? They don't know where to start. So where would you recommend somebody start? A couple of simple, practical things they could do to, I like maturing their compliance in their practice. Where would you
Yeah. I what I strongly encourage, it's interesting. This is going to sound super geeky, but the OIG just released sort of an updated version of what the basic elements of a compliance program is, right?
Oh,
And they haven't, I think it's been some years since they've reissued that guidance. We've always followed the same one, but now they just recently updated early part of November. I think it's good to take a look at it. It is in simplified formats. They actually even have a document geared towards physician practices. Like from a
perfect.
compliance standpoint, there's a resource specifically for physician practices, and take a look at it.
Mhm.
Walk yourself through it, because that is your starting point, right? It is, I call the OIG the big dogs of healthcare, regulatory or advisory. Those are the folks you want to just kind of listen to. And they're giving you resources in a simplified manner and saying, hey, this is what we consider a good compliance program to look like. And here are the things that we would be looking for. And I think that's a wonderful place to start, right? And then if you have any additional questions or concerns, I mean, there is a plethora of additional resources and organizations and vendors that can assist with maturing your knowledge on compliance. I think reason why compliance is shunned a lot of times is because it just seems so overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
We think of it as a hard stop for our operational aspect of our practices or our small businesses. We don't look at it as a value add, and it really is, right? When I talk about billing and coding compliance, what's the point of collecting if you can't keep the reimbursement,
Yeah.
right? That's what compliance does. It sort of ensures or retains that you have the right ground to be able to grow and scale and do all of the great things that we all want to do when it comes to our businesses in healthcare. It just creates safeguards for you. So yeah, I would start with the most obvious resources, and they're giving it to you. They're saying, here, please look at this. Really
That's
read
great.
this.
I wasn't aware that
Um,
that's out there. That's fantastic.
It
Yeah.
is. It really is. It's on the OIG's website. You can Google it and it's right there for you.
What would somebody Google to get it?
So you would go specifically to, and I should know this, but you would go to the Office of Inspector General's website, right?
Mhm.
The OIG. And then it's splashy front page news, because in the compliance world, this is like the best thing since sliced bread, right? To have these new updated revisions and guidelines for a compliance program. So it's right there. I'm happy to also send you the link so that your listeners could possibly get it
Yeah,
if
please.
yeah, so it's just a great resource, and it can seem a little overwhelming maybe if you've never even known that there's 7 elements to a good compliance program and how to work through them. But I encourage you to read it anyway,
Mhm.
right? And just see where you can start based off of those 7 elements and bite off little baby pieces,
Mhm.
because the first step is to start, right? The problem is when you don't start. So
Yeah. Well, what sounds nice about this, the OIG's offer is that if you're wondering, so what's in a program? Well, they're just going to tell you. So
yes,
that just the
yes,
whole it gets bigger before it gets smaller just got a lot faster because now you know
absolutely.
what to compare it against. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's perfect.
Absolutely.
Leslie, thank you. This has been
You're so
great.
welcome.
Yeah, thank you for coming on Practice Care and opening our eyes to this. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me. And I'm just super honored to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. And so Leslie Boles with Revu Healthcare. For the show notes for Leslie's episode, you supplied some contact info. It's all going to get in there. So anybody who wants to contact you, there's a good place to go. Couple of points before we wrap up. First, if you're someone like Leslie or I who seeks to help private practice owners in one way or another, or you're a private practice owner yourself, either way, if you've got some experience on the business side of private practice that you think others would benefit from, I want to hear about it. We want to get you on Practice Care as soon as we can so that you can share your knowledge with the world. In the show notes for Leslie's episode and every episode, there's a link, a couple of clicks. Tell us what's on your mind so we can get you scheduled as soon as possible. And finally, we do a new episode of Practice Care every week. the easiest and best way to stay up to date is to subscribe to Practice Care. We are on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, all the major platforms, all the major players. Subscribe, and that way, when a new episode comes out, you're going to be notified. Thanks very much, and until next time.